So let's get into it. We're going to talk a little bit about who Anthropic is. We're going to talk a little bit about our ideas around responsible AI and data privacy. And then there was a bit of mentioning around prompt engineering and a little bit on RAG as well. I want to talk about prompt engineering in a little more depth. And then there was a high-level glance at fine-tuning, which I think was excellent because fine-tuning is really not always the thing you want to jump for. But I want to just make sure we have a sense of where all these things fit into the ecosystem. So prompt engineering, we'll get back to RAG a little bit. We'll talk about fine-tuning as we go through. We'll wrap up with some use cases, and then any questions as you have them, feel free to throw them in. I'll be peeking at the chat a little bit. Let's get into it. So Anthropic is a wonderful, wonderful company focused on AI safety at the frontier. So at Anthropic, we were started by 8 really, really spectacular folks at the OpenAI team, coming from a Stripe background as well, starting in 2021. So we have not been around for that long, yet we've been able to produce not only one of the most intelligent models in the world with Claude 3.5 Sonnet, but also some of the most really powerful research in this space, not only focusing on the models themselves, but understanding how these models work a bit under the hood. So this idea of interpretability and how can we explain why the models are producing outputs that they are. Ideas around constitutional AI and AI safety are things that we are really, really proud of and that we specialize in. Like I mentioned, we're a much smaller organization as opposed to some of the bigger ones out there. So yet over the course since April 23, when we released our first model, to July 24, we've been able to catch up quite a bit in terms of overall benchmark scores. We've been really, really proud of the accomplishments that we've been able to make over such a short period of time. Talking about the different models that we have at Anthropic, we don't believe that it's a one size fits all. So we have, kind of like a Pareto modeling for the models that we have. Our smallest model, Claude 3 Haiku, is the cheapest by far, is not the best at tasks that require tremendous amounts of intelligence and sophistication. We have Claude 3 Opus and now Claude 3.5 Sonnet on the other end of the spectrum, which are much more intelligent at a slightly higher price point. So there is no one model that is going to solve every single use case, but depending on what your constraints are, whether that is performance in terms of latency, whether that's cost, whether that's intellectual requirements from the model, we have a lot of different options that fit all different kinds of enterprise use cases. A little bit more on Claude 3.5 Sonnet. This was released quite recently. This is one of the most intelligent models on the market compared to benchmark scores. Again, we're always going to encourage everyone to take these scores with a bit of a grain of salt because, again, everybody's use case is slightly different. Some models may do better at certain things than others, but Claude 3.5 Sonnet is an incredibly powerful model for a variety of use cases for all types of industries, from coding to customer support to data science. If you're looking to read a little bit more about some of these use cases, we've got a lot of really great guides on the website as well as our documentation. So always welcome folks to dig into that, look at it a little bit more. And towards the end of this presentation, I'll be talking about that as well. Responsible AI and data privacy. There was a lot of really good conversation around data privacy. As you all saw before, we are one of the models offered through the entire Bedrock interface, and you've seen quite a bit on the data privacy side of things. What I want to talk a little bit more about is this idea of responsible AI. So as you are all well aware, AI safety is a very, very, very big concern. And at the enterprise scale, this is one of the most important things that we need to be thinking about. And AI safety and security is a massive, massive topic. But what is so, I would say, scary about this is there's just so much unknown. We don't know what these models are going to be able to do as they start getting better and faster. We don't know what malicious actors may potentially do with these models. So there is a tremendous, tremendous amount of concern. And that is why safety and security is paramount for what we're doing at Anthropic. Like we mentioned, we are at the AI frontier. We believe very, very, very strongly that in order to convince folks about the safety and steerability of our models, we have to be at the frontier with the most powerful models out there. So our mission as a company is to build safe, transformative AI for all use cases, very much focused on the enterprise. So as you all saw a bit, we work closely with Bedrock on the security standpoint, but some of the things that we do that are a little bit different, I would say, than others are focused on steerability and interpretability. So constitutional AI is a idea, a mechanism, a means of feedback that Anthropic released. And this is one of the, I would say, groundbreaking pieces of research that we came up with, which is where we can take a model that has been completed in the pre-training process. It's been trained on a corpus of data, but now we need to make it helpful, honest, and harmless. So what we do is we actually train another model on some of the most powerful constitutions that we have as a society. So the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Apple's Terms of Service, documents that we as a society have agreed upon are ways that we want to steer these models and our society. And we train these models using constitutional AI to then further help our larger models become more steerable and more helpful, more honest, and more harmless. This is research that we are on the frontier of, and things that we are super, super proud of. We recently released a paper diving deep into how the models work a bit more under the hood. This field of mechanistic interpretability, as we like to call it, is really how we're pulling apart the neurons in the network, how we're diving into how we can activate certain parts of the model so that as we get more larger scale models, more complex, more powerful models, we can really try to steer them in certain directions. So there was a really interesting question that was mentioned earlier of how do you ensure that these models are producing accurate outputs given certain inputs? And there are many different mechanisms we can use there. There's prompt engineering, there's requiring citations, there's making sure your LLM is producing the background or semantic meaning as to why it's retrieved something. But at a much higher level, things that we're working on internally are also thinking about how we can steer these models in certain directions, how that can be done from an overall company level, but also from a developer level as well. So all things that we're thinking about on the frontier. Like I mentioned, talked a little bit about this idea of constitutional AI to build safer AI at scale. So the goal here is to codify a set of principles to reduce harmful behavior. And instead of using more traditional feedback mechanisms like reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is where you're asking humans to determine what is safe, what is not going to cause harm, what is problematic, what is not problematic, we can use AI to help with the first pass of that to produce a more honest, helpful, and harmless model at the end of the day. This is one of the most important AI innovations in our mind. There are also many other folks that agree with this. And this idea of constitutional AI is now being applied to quite a few different model providers, as well as federal institutions and government as well. So this is something that we take very seriously, and we're very proud of the work that we've done in this space. Talks a little bit more about this idea of interpretability, so creating a more understandable AI. One of the things that is so fascinating about this space is we've built this tool, we've built these LLMs that do really, really, really interesting things that produce really meaningful output, yet we don't actually understand how they work. And while that can sound very, very scary, if it's not researched, if there isn't effort put into understanding the black box, that's in our mind where things get scary. So we have a very large team here focusing quite a bit on trying to understand why the LLM generates a specific output. And we're trying to do this really from a scientific standpoint. So we are dealing with massive, massive neural networks with neurons interacting and arriving at answers. We're trying to figure out why that is. And that requires a tremendous amount of research, but something, again, that we're focused on quite a bit that helps differentiate us, but also helps showcase our focus on creating safe and scalable systems that we understand. So really something that I would say is a bit different from our lab versus some of the other labs out there, really trying to focus on the why a bit behind these systems. As you all saw before, Anthropic works very closely with AWS. Bedrock is an incredibly powerful service that allows us to keep the model and the data in the same infrastructure, simplifies quite a bit around governance and security. And as we're going to talk about a little bit, gives us the option of fine-tuning on the AWS ecosystem. Again, I will absolutely jump to the conclusion. Fine-tuning is a wonderful, wonderful option, but really for a very, 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 very specific use case. So I think fine-tuning, as you're going to see, might seem like the answer to all your problems, but very often is not actually the case. That being said, there are some very specialized use cases, and the fact that we can do that on Bedrock is wonderful. We have a very, 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 very skilled team of solution architects, and so does the AWS team. So the ability for us to work with AWS and work with customers jointly really allows us to produce a phenomenal product that does really, really powerful work. I I want to shift gears a little bit and talk more about the idea around prompt engineering and specifically a little bit around fine tuning. But I just want to check in and see if there are any questions before we get to that. So I know we've had some kind of audio issues and so on, but Ron, if you can hear me or if there's anything in the chat, I just want to monitor that and make sure that
I can hear you fine. And I don't see any immediate questions right now. This is very incredibly valuable insight, so I would just keep going.
All right, sounds great. All right, onwards. Let's shift into the idea of prompt engineering. We'll talk a little bit about fine tuning. Ron made some really, I would say, powerful insights around, prompt engineering it's not low coding, it's really just English. I think a lot of times folks take the word engineering and prompt engineering and treat it the same way as civil engineering, software engineering, and so on. I think the word engineering is a bit challenging in this context because the idea around prompt engineering is really just finding the right language and the right flow and the right structure to get what you want out of the LLM. And again, it goes back to the idea of a bit of a black box. We don't totally know exactly how all of these pieces are working under the hood. So there has to be a very iterative process on our end to get what we want out of the model. Most of the optimizations that you can do, the model is not giving me the result I want. The model is hallucinating. The model is not providing the correct citations. The model is not giving me enough examples. The model is giving me results that are all over the place. The first line of defense should be prompt engineering. The second line of defense should be prompt engineering. So this is really one place that you want to start and invest quite a bit of time on so that you can make sure that you're doing it right. Different models have different, I would say, suggestions or guidelines with prompt engineering. Fortunately, those are becoming a bit more standardized. So what I'm going to show you, some things are a bit more applicable to the Claude family of models, but at the same time, you can take this to another particular model and get some really beneficial insights. It's another really good question earlier I want to follow up on, which is just how do we measure the effectiveness of these prompts? How do we measure that they're getting us the results that we want? Well, the same way that you would write automated tests, unit test, integration test, end-to-end tests with your software, we have this entire field of evaluations. And evaluations are simply just ways that we can assess the quality of the output for a given prompt and some variables that go into the prompt. So this kind of field and idea around evaluations, that's really how we test the efficacy, the honesty, the accuracy of our prompts when we work with them. There's a wide degree of tools for the evals ecosystem. A couple of those were kind of mentioned when comparing different models, and I'll show you a little bit about what we have at Anthropic as well. So without further ado, this is a slide that I think we've seen a little bit before, so I'll go over it very quickly. But a prompt is the information you pass to your large language model to elicit a response. This includes the content of what you would like. What do we mean by the content? What are you trying to get out of the model? What question is trying to be answered? What explanation do you need? What clarity are you seeking? This also includes data, and this idea is very important. So is there information in the prompt, for example, an article that you might want summarized or examples that you might want to pass in? In a prompt, you also might have some history of conversation. So as you keep prompting, there is an entire conversation or history that is included. In the prompt, there are often instructions, ways that you want the output to be formatted, ways that you want the LLM to think about how it provides a response. And then one of the things that we see very, very commonly, one of the most powerful tools that we can use in prompt engineering is this idea of examples. You're also going to hear this as kind of shots. So 1 shot, 3 shot, N shot, 10 shot. Sounds like a Dr. Seuss book. But this idea of examples is really just how can we give our prompt some kind of example for what we're trying to get out. And this is really one of the most powerful things you can do. A lot of these ideas actually seem relatively reasonable. Makes sense that you would have some instructions. Makes sense that you would have some examples. The problem with prompt engineering is that sometimes you take all of these ideas and you try to shove them into this prompt and just expect you're always going to get the output you want. And it's really more a process of prompt iteration or prompt tweaking as opposed to prompt engineering. So with that said, I'm going to show you what looks like a very intimidating slide here, mostly because of all the colors. But the best practices around a prompt include things like the tone, the background data, the examples, the conversation history, making sure that you ask your LLM to think about your answers first. Many times this can be elaborated quite a bit. not only think about your answer first before you respond, but I would like you to think this way. I would like you to first make this plan. I would like you to then think about where in that plan there might be inaccuracies. I'd like you to then review the plan. I'd like you to then think about what I put in the data. There's quite a bit that you can do here. You can also pre-fill what you would like the response to be. Maybe you want that in a particular format. Maybe you want to minimize the amount of tokens you are outputting. You look at this and you think to yourself, well, it makes sense why I need to hire a team of prompt engineers because there's so many different things. What we like to do at Anthropic and what we've seen with so many customers is actually start backwards. And what we have is this idea of what is called meta prompting. We have a tool in the Anthropic console, and this is also a Jupyter notebook that you can run if you're doing things on different platforms, called the prompt generator. And the prompt generator lives on the Anthropic console. And you can generate a prompt by taking any task and turning it into a high quality prompt. So what we have is this idea of meta prompting, where instead of you having to look at that slide with all those different colors and all those different examples, you can instead make it a little bit easier for yourself. So you can take something like recommending a product, and you can generate this, you can change the text that you want, and you can generate the prompt that you want from that. And granted, this is not going to be perfect, but this is going to check a lot of the boxes that we have for best practices and give you a place to start. So this idea of meta prompting is so powerful because we've seen from years of doing this and from endless customer conversations, a lot of times the prompts just get out of hand and we have to kind of scope it down a bit. And we end up getting back to something that looks like this so much. So what we have at Anthropic that we really push folks towards is, instead of trying to do prompt engineering from 0 to 100, we'll give you the first 50, we'll give you the first 70, maybe even the first 90, and you work your way backwards. So we have created a prompt that actually captures the best practices and generates prompts. That's the term meta prompting as we describe it. This lives at our console. You can look at this in the documentation. You can even see a Jupyter notebook with the source code for this prompt. So this is not something that is super proprietary. This is just something that we've made available to folks to produce the best prompts possible. The idea, again, get started with a quality prompt and iterate from there. This lives at console.anthropic.com, and you can start playing around with it to get some sense of your prompts. You can take this and try it out with other models. You can put this in your evaluation suite. There's quite a bit of work that can be done here, and it's something that we are constantly iterating on because this idea of prompt engineering is one of the easiest, cheapest, fastest ways to try to squeeze the most benefit out of your LLM. So it's really something we invest a lot of time and effort into. Let's talk a little bit more about the prompt structure. Here's what you get: 1 or 2 sentences for your role and high-level task. There have been a couple examples of prompts where we've seen people really try to, I would say, hype up the LLM with you have 7 PhDs in mathematics from the most incredible universities in the world. You are the most brilliant mathematician. You can solve every single math problem, and it doesn't really do too much. So again, we try to keep things relatively simple with the prompt. If there is dynamic content, if there's any information that needs to be generated, that lives right under that. We then provide detailed instructions. Again, you don't need to be incredibly verbose, but you want to be really mindful of being clear. You want to be concise. You want to provide the steps you need for your model to give you what you want. We then have this idea, example, we call that end shot. In general, you want to give at least 3 to 5 examples. There is no one magical number for the right number of examples, but unless for some reason you can't provide any, it's always recommended to have some kind of examples here. Concluding and repeating critical instructions, as well as some other format, is what you're going to get right out of the box. It's then your job to kind of tweak things, lean into some of the best practices that we have, and that's where you go. So again, prompt engineering is really the first place to start and continue onwards. Once you get past the prompt engineering part, once you even get past the RAG part that we saw before, there might require a real want and potential need for fine-tuning. So what is the idea of fine-tuning? Models are pre-trained with ginormous amounts of data, corpuses of text from the internet, images, video, content, etc., audio. They then produce a base model that is fine-tuned. This is where we introduce ideas like constitutional AI, making sure we have the ability to keep these models safe, harmless, helpful, and honest. But there might be a situation where we deliver a model to a customer and that customer wants to then continue that process of tweaking the model's outputs. The most important thing to realize with fine-tuning is that fine-tuning is not the place to teach the model brand new things and expect it to learn those things perfectly. So sometimes people look at fine-tuning with the solution for me to teach my model everything that Anthropic did not teach the model. Not exactly. If you have very specialized tasks, if you have very, very specific use cases where the model may have an idea of what it is, but you really want to tweak and steer that particular output, fine-tuning can be a great option. Fine-tuning does have a pretty large upfront cost, but once you have fine-tuned a model, you then have the ability to get latency improvements. This could be an alternative to using something like RAG. You don't have to go to the vector database. You don't have to put your queries and embed them and so on. You can then also have consistent formats. And again, this is the ability to do fine-tuning in the AWS Bedrock environment. So we get all those safety benefits as well. Like I mentioned, how does fine-tuning work? You provide a tremendous amount of data, very commonly in a JSON-L format. So what does that mean? You're providing inputs and you are providing the correct output. So in the case of pre-training, there's just a bunch of input and the model dreams. The model just tries to figure out what comes next. In the case of fine-tuning, you put in the input, you provide the output. What do I want when someone puts something into the LLM? What do I want the output to be? What do I want to really try to improve with this base model to deliver some kind of custom model? As you can imagine with fine-tuning, one of the drawbacks is you've done a great job curating all this data. That takes time, that takes money. You've done a great job taking an existing model that we have and using the hardware that AWS has to produce this custom model. But now a new model is released. You can't exactly just take your fine-tuned model and click once and all of a sudden you have a new fine-tuned model. So this does make the switching costs of models quite a bit higher, and that's something also to consider. Like we saw before, there is no one size fits all. This landscape is changing. If I were to present this in 1 or 2 weeks, I'm sure a bunch of the slides would be different. So with fine-tuning, you're kind of making it a bit, I would say, permanent in time. And that can be helpful in certain use cases, but also something to watch out for as you think about your particular business use case. So when should you fine tune? This is a really powerful slide that I like. Let's start from the bottom up. You want to teach the model new knowledge and expect it to use that for general tasks. That's probably not going to happen with fine tuning. And this is where we've seen some really good use cases, or really good kind of stories or anecdotes of it really doesn't happen that much. I think sometimes fine tuning tends to be the thing that people reach for, but we do have way better options. Prompt engineering, and prompt engineering. And then if there's an external knowledge base or so on, doesn't fit in your context window or your prompt, move to things like RAG, which are extremely common. So if you teach the model a new skill, if you teach the model new knowledge, that's really where fine-tuning is not going to be particularly successful. On the other hand, teaching the model a new skill, teaching it how to classify something, teaching it information about proprietary documents in a very specific use case, you will have a high likelihood of success with fine-tuning. Granted, fine-tuning also depends on the quality of your data, the amount of your data, the model that you're fine-tuning. So lots of other inputs and variables that can determine your end result. But again, this is where fine-tuning, I would say, shines a bit more. So I'll make sure that you all kind of have these slides as a quick visual, because I think this showcases quite a bit of what I've been talking about, where you want to think about shifting into RAG before going to fine-tuning, which is very commonly the path, as we saw with the previous presentation. Claude 3 Haiku, which is our smallest, cheapest model, is available for fine-tuning in Bedrock. We saw a bit on the different pricing structures. You can pay per token. There is provision throughput as well. So there's quite a bit in terms of the kind of ecosystem and getting started here. I'll kind of leave this as a high-level bit of information. But right now, what we support using fine-tuning is our Haiku model. We've seen that because this is where you can kind of get the most benefits from our model. Haiku is our cheapest model and makes it a little bit easier to fine tune. That being said, you can see a lot of benefits. You can explore this in the Bedrock ecosystem. Talk a little bit about some use cases, and then we'll wrap up here with any Q&A. In the financial services ecosystem, there is quite a bit you can do with tools like Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Again, Claude 3.5 Sonnet is one of the most powerful and smart models on the market. It is also quite a fast model. So if there are plans for financial advisory or client conversations, whether that's in a chatbot ecosystem or internally, there's quite a bit you can do. using tools like RAG, taking in SEC filings or 10Ks or whatever financial documents necessary, you can generate very comprehensive investment theses. There's quite a bit on the trend analysis side of things. So Claude 3.5 Sonnet does a really, really remarkable job at taking images, taking content, taking text, and generating trends and insights from that data. One of the most important things you want to do in general whenever working with external data is make sure you have your LLM cite where it's getting that data. Because sometimes it can be really exciting to get this wonderful trend from financial data. But again, if the model is hallucinating, you got to make sure that the citation the model is providing is accurate. And many times, as much as you might want another AI to review those citations, we still need humans here at the end of the day. In the technology ecosystem, there's a tremendous amount that we're seeing more and more and more with rapid prototyping and code migration. Many companies have older code bases or older technologies, whether that's Python 2 or different testing ecosystems, and they feed that through Claude 3.5 Sonnet to produce a different testing ecosystem, a more recent version of a language, and so on, to generate not only high quality prototypes, but also migrate from existing or older technologies. And this often is a very tedious process that requires quite a bit of testing, quite a bit of code writing. This is where LLMs can really shine right now, and they're just only getting better and better. I want to wrap up here. I know we've got a couple minutes left, but I just wanted to say again, thank you all so much for listening in. I know there's been a lot of presentations, hard to kind of get the energy back in the room, but I really want to thank you all for taking a little bit of time to kind of listen to who we are, what we do. And with that, I'll just open the floor to some questions here.